The man who put the first humans on the moon spent his formative years building weapons of mass destruction inside a Third Reich that prayed to Viking gods, sent expeditions to Tibet in search of occult power, and believed the Aryan race descended from a cosmic master civilization that science had yet to rediscover. And then America shook his hand, erased his file, and called him a hero. This isn't a story about one man's moral compromise. This is the story of a current that ran from the burning, rune-lit castles of Nazi Germany straight into the heart of the American space program. And that current never fully stopped flowing. When you look at the people who built the rockets, who launched the satellites, who aimed humanity at the stars, you find something the official history buried under medals and ticker tape parades. The foundation of modern space exploration was built by men whose world did not separate hard engineering from ancient mysticism, military power from occult ritual, or the coldest scientific pragmatism from the most fervent belief in forces beyond the visible universe. That foundation is still underneath everything we call the space age. Right now, today, the rockets that carry satellites into orbit trace their design lineage directly to machines built by SS officers at a remote facility on the Baltic Sea, where the peculiar spiritual atmosphere that surrounded the Nazi scientific elite was not separate from the engineering work, but woven through it, through institutions like the Ahnenerbe that sought to uncover ancient lost knowledge, believed to prove a cosmic origin for the Aryan race. And on the other side of the Atlantic, at the very same moment, the American rocket program was being built by a man who recited Aleister Crowley's Hymn to Pan at rocket test sites, and who described his propulsion work and his occult practice in the same breath as facets of a single project. Two continents, two completely different cultures, two radically different political systems, both building rockets, both doing it inside a world where science and the supernatural were not opposites. They were, for the people involved, partners. Where does that leave you? It leaves you sitting on top of a space age whose real origin story has never been told in full. And that is exactly where we are going today. Before we do, if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is where history shows you its face without the makeup on. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I genuinely want to know what corner of the world is watching this with me. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind that do not make it into textbooks, hit subscribe. It takes 3 seconds and it means everything. Now let's start at the very beginning. Because to understand how occult ideology ended up embedded in the DNA of American rocketry, you need to understand the boys who first dreamed of space and the world those dreams were born inside. The year is 1927. Germany is a country that feels like it is standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. The Weimar Republic is lurching from crisis to crisis. Hyperinflation has already gutted the savings of an entire generation. Street violence between political factions is becoming routine, and across the culture, there is a sensation of waiting, of pressure building, of something vast and transformative about to break through the surface of ordinary life. In that atmosphere, electric, unstable, desperate for transcendence, a 15-year-old boy named Wernher von Braun is sitting in his room in Berlin, reading a book about interplanetary travel, and feeling what he would later describe as the most overwhelming certainty of his life, that he would one day reach the stars. Von Braun was born into a Prussian aristocratic family. His father a baron, banker, and politician of the old order. His mother was a keen amateur astronomer, and when young Wernher was confirmed in the Lutheran church, she gave him a telescope as a gift. Most kids get a watch or a Bible. He got the sky. From that point forward, the sky was the only thing that mattered. By his teenage years, he had written a manuscript about astronomy. Before he was old enough to drive, he was conducting rocket experiments and corresponding with other young obsessives across Europe and even across the Atlantic. One of those correspondents was a teenager in Pasadena, California, with grease-stained hands and a hunger for danger that nobody around him could understand. His name was Jack Parsons. As teenagers in the 1920s, when space travel existed only in science fiction novels. Von Braun in Germany and Parsons in California exchanged letters about experiments, ideas, and rocket fuel. Two boys, an ocean apart, dreaming the same impossible dream. Both of them would help build the rockets that carried humanity to the moon. Both of them would carry into that work a set of beliefs that the official histories would spend decades trying to minimize. But here is what you need to understand about the world these boys were growing up inside, because without it, none of what comes next makes any sense. In 1920s Germany, the line between science and the occult was not where it is today. The fascination with mysticism had been building in Germany long before Hitler's rise to power. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a sustained surge of interest in esoteric beliefs. Secret societies and occult movements increased in visibility, often merging ancient Germanic myths with modern, and frequently racist, ideologies. This was not a fringe phenomenon. Professors, engineers, military officers, artists, all of them swimming in the same water, breathing the same air, an air thick with the conviction that beneath the rational surface of the modern world lay forces that science had not yet measured, but that certain initiates could access, channel, and use. For a young man with von Braun's ambitions, this world was the backdrop of daily life, and sometimes more than a backdrop. The peculiar spiritual atmosphere that surrounded the Nazi scientific elite did not begin when Hitler came to power. It was already forming, already seeping into the institutions where ambitious young scientists went to make their careers. And when the Nazi state arrived to make those ambitions possible, to fund the laboratories, build the facilities, hand over the resources, it arrived wearing both faces at once, the cold face of industrial modernity and the burning face of ancient myth. Von Braun's rocket dream did not belong to him alone. It belonged to an entire generation of German young men who had been raised on a story that said the Germanic people were not merely a nation, but a cosmic force, heirs to a civilization that had mastered the secrets of the universe before the fall of recorded history. That story was being told in universities, in secret societies, in the publications of a dozen different mystical movements. And when those young men grew up and went to work building machines that would literally leave the earth, they carried that story with them. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but inescapably, the way anyone carries the atmosphere of the world that formed them. When the Nazi Party seized power in 1933, von Braun's work was almost immediately elevated to a national priority. The regime saw the immense potential of rocketry, and von Braun, as the army's top civilian specialist, was perfectly positioned to benefit from their ambition. He was 20 years old. He had the dream, and now, suddenly, he had the power of a state behind it. His small research station near Berlin soon proved inadequate for the scale of the work envisioned. In 1937, the entire program was moved to a vast, top-secret facility constructed at Peenemünde, a remote peninsula on the Baltic Sea coast. And this is where the story takes a turn into somewhere darker than any official history has fully acknowledged. Close your eyes and try to picture it. Not the concrete test stands and the engineering drawings. Those come later. First, picture what was there before. A strip of Baltic coastline at the edge of the world. Wind cutting in off grey water. Pine forests that had stood since before any human memory. A sky so wide and empty that looking at it felt like confronting something immense and indifferent. The village had been mentioned in documents as far back as the 13th century. A fishing settlement so remote that most of the country had never heard of it. The site was chosen for operational secrecy and the safety buffer that isolation provided during high-velocity rocket testing. But isolation does something to people that military planners don't factor into their equations. Cut off from the rest of the world, pressed together by a common obsession, surrounded by the ancient, cold weight of the Baltic, the men of Peenemünde built something that was more than a laboratory. They built a world unto themselves. At its peak, thousands of engineers and technicians lived and worked there, most of them young, most of them brilliant, all of them consumed by the same driving question: how do you build a machine that can escape the Earth? That question, in that place, at that time, inside the Third Reich, was never purely technical. It could not be. The peculiar spiritual atmosphere that surrounded the Nazi scientific elite flowed directly from the institutions that shaped those men's careers. In the 1930s, Himmler's SS fostered an ideology steeped in Teutonic mysticism, Aryan mythology, and pseudo-occult science. Himmler had founded the Ahnenerbe in 1935, a pseudo-scientific organization established as an SS appendage devoted to promoting racial theories, consisting of academics and scientists from a broad range of disciplines, who fostered the idea that Germans descended from an Aryan race which was racially superior to all others. It conducted expeditions worldwide, including most famously to Tibet and Scandinavia, searching for evidence of ancient Aryan civilizations and their mystical practices. The Ahnenerbe claimed to be a scientific institute. What it was actually doing was building a mythology, a framework for understanding the relationship between the human race and the cosmos that treated the recovery of ancient spiritual knowledge and the mastery of modern physical forces as the same project, pursued through different instruments. That mythology lived in the minds of the men at Peenemünde. You cannot spend years inside an institution this saturated with a particular worldview and remain entirely untouched by it. The question is not whether the rocket scientists absorbed something of the Nazi esoteric atmosphere. The institutional record makes clear they existed within it. The question is, what exactly that absorption produced in their understanding of what the work meant. And here is where the story gets genuinely strange, because that understanding had a remarkably precise American equivalent already waiting on the other side of the world. His name was Marvel Whiteside Parsons. He went by Jack, and if you want to understand Jack Parsons, you have to abandon the comfortable category of eccentric. That word has been used to defang him, to make him safe, to put him behind glass in the Museum of Historical Curiosities. Parsons was not eccentric. He operated from a perfectly coherent internal framework, one that told him the universe was not the way the scientific establishment described it, that there were forces operating behind the material surface of reality, and that the way to engage those forces was not through passive contemplation, but through action, through will, through a practice that fused the physical and the metaphysical. And then he went and invented the solid fuel rocket. Born in 1914 in Los Angeles, Parsons was largely self-taught in rocketry. Associated with the California Institute of Technology, he was one of the principal founders of both the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the Aerojet Engineering Corporation. He invented the first rocket engine to use a castable, composite rocket propellant and pioneered the advancement of both liquid fuel and solid fuel rockets. The solid motors on the space shuttle and the motors in the Minuteman missile were based on the solid propellant technology that he invented. He was a founding member of Aerojet Corporation. He has a crater on the far side of the moon named after him, and he was a devoted Thelemite, a follower of Aleister Crowley's occult philosophy, a member of Ordo Templi Orientis, and the head of the Agape Lodge of the OTO in California. At his Pasadena mansion, a large boarding house that attracted artists, writers, scientists, and occultists, in a combination that had no equivalent anywhere else in America, Parsons would lead ritual workings from Crowley's texts. He recited Crowley's Hymn to Pan at rocket test sites, treating the invocation as part of the operational sequence, rather than as separate from it. He described his propulsion work to Crowley himself in the language of magical operation, writing that he was engaged in the great work, the Thelemite term for the willed transformation of consciousness and reality, and that the rockets were an instrument of that work. Both activities, in his mind, served the same ultimate aim: to break through the limitations of what the existing order said was possible. Crowley's response reveals how seriously both men took this parallel. In a letter to Carl Germer, Crowley expressed concern. "I am very worried about Jack. It seems to me that if he cannot be brought to his senses, there is only one thing to do, and that is to make a test case and suppress the whole of his magical activities." That is as close as Crowley, a man who had spent his entire adult life in practices most of the world considered beyond reason, came to telling someone else to pull back. That was the distance Parsons was willing to travel, but the official history in its rush to celebrate the technical achievement and quietly bracket the personal strangeness, misses something important. Parsons was not an isolated oddity whose private beliefs happened to coexist with genuine scientific talent. He was operating inside a coherent tradition, one that held that science and occult practice were complementary approaches to the same fundamental project, understanding and ultimately transcending the limitations of the physical world. That tradition, on the American side, ran from Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism through the Golden Dawn and into Crowley's Thelema. On the German side, it ran from the Tula Society and the Germanenorden through the SS and into the Ahnenerbe. Different maps, overlapping territory. And now we reach Operation Paperclip, where those two maps were placed for the first time, side by side. The official story is this. Faced with a potentially catastrophic Soviet rocket advantage, the American government made a pragmatic and uncomfortable decision to recruit the best German rocket scientists available, quietly sidestep the question of their wartime activities, and put them to work winning the Cold War. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to America under the program. Officials within the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency and the Office of Strategic Services bypassed Truman's directives by eliminating or whitewashing incriminating evidence of possible war crimes from the scientists' records, believing their intelligence to be crucial. The records were sanitized. The men arrived clean on paper, but records are the least of what a person carries. A person carries their formation, the years of immersion in a particular culture, a particular way of seeing, a particular set of assumptions about what the universe is and what humanity's relationship to it could be. That formation cannot be reclassified. It comes with the body. Von Braun himself had worn that formation visibly. He became a member of the Nazi Party in 1937 and was made a junior SS officer in 1940, not as a passive formality, but as membership in the organization that more than any other had institutionalized the marriage of military power and esoteric belief. He attended SS functions. He existed within that culture for the years when his character as a scientist and a leader was most fully formed. The tension inside that formation surfaced in March of 1944. At a social gathering at Peenemünde, von Braun made remarks, variously described as the result of wine and late hours, that Germany was likely to lose the war, and that his real purpose was to build a spaceship, not a weapon. He was arrested by the Gestapo, along with his brother and two associates, and was only freed through the personal intervention of Albert Speer and General Dornberger, who argued he was irreplaceable to the war effort. He survived, but Himmler never trusted him again. What that arrest revealed, underneath the official story of a victimized scientist, was the depth of the split inside the man. He was building history's most devastating weapon while dreaming, with enough passion to risk his life saying it out loud, of spacecraft. And he was doing all of this inside an institution that treated the stars as a spiritual inheritance, not merely a technical destination. That split, and the years of formation that produced it, did not dissolve when he boarded a plane for America. What von Braun and his colleagues brought to the United States was not simply technical knowledge. It was a way of thinking about the relationship between machine, human will, and cosmic aspiration that had been shaped by years inside an institution where those three things were never considered fully separate. The equations were real. The metallurgy was real. The propulsion science was genuinely revolutionary. And alongside all of that, not replacing it, not competing with it, but coexisting with it, was a set of assumptions about what the act of leaving the Earth actually meant. Those assumptions landed in a country where Jack Parsons had already been working for years from a strikingly parallel position. That the rocket was not merely a vehicle, but an instrument of transformation. That the fire at its base was connected to something older and larger than any single engineering achievement. That the people building these machines were participating in a project whose significance exceeded any political or military justification anyone had yet articulated. Parsons never met the Peenemünde veterans in any documented, meaningful way. There is no record of a conversation, no shared correspondence, no moment where the two currents explicitly acknowledged each other. They didn't need to. The parallel was structural, not conspiratorial. Both sides had arrived at the same place through entirely different routes. And when the paperclip scientists moved into the institutions that Parsons and his JPL colleagues had helped build, the two traditions occupied the same buildings, shared the same equipment, and trained the same next generation of engineers. Parsons himself did not survive to see what that convergence produced. In January and February of 1946, he undertook what he called the Babylon working, a series of ritual operations he believed would invoke a transformative spiritual force into the material world. He performed the workings in the Mojave Desert in 2 phases across those months, documenting everything in his journal with the same methodical precision he brought to his laboratory work. He believed the operations succeeded. What followed in his life was a rapid unraveling. His finances collapsed, his relationships disintegrated, and the FBI, which had been monitoring his activities for years, finally stripped him of his security clearance, ending his ability to do classified work and effectively severing him from the program he had helped to create. On the 4th of June, 1952, an explosion destroyed his home laboratory in Pasadena. He was 37 years old. The official finding was accidental, a spill of fulminate of mercury, a volatile compound he had worked with for years. People who knew him noted that Parsons was among the most safety-conscious chemists in the field, and the precise circumstances of the explosion have never been established beyond dispute. What is not in dispute is what he left behind: the propellant formulas, the institutional foundations, the theoretical groundwork for the solid-fuel rockets that would power every American ballistic missile and every shuttle launch for decades afterward. He has a crater on the far side of the moon, the side that never faces the Earth. The men who inherited what both Parsons and the Peenemünde veterans built, the engineers and flight directors and mission controllers of the Apollo era, worked inside a culture shaped by both traditions. Without necessarily knowing the full dimensions of either, they were young, technically brilliant, operating under pressures that forced a form of collective discipline and precision that exceeded anything a normal workplace produces. The average age of controllers in mission control during Apollo 11 was around 26. They had been trained by the German veterans, had absorbed their methodologies, had inherited the institutional culture that those men established at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. That culture carried something forward that none of the official accounts have fully named. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden ritual practice, something more durable and less dramatic than either of those things. A way of experiencing the work as something larger than its technical components. A sense, shared widely enough to shape institutional behavior, even when never explicitly stated, that what they were doing was not merely an engineering project with political justifications, that the act of leaving the Earth carried a weight of meaning that the mission parameters could not contain. Von Braun articulated this more directly as he aged. In his later years, he wrote and spoke extensively about the spiritual dimensions of space exploration, using language that consistently reached beyond the secular and technical. He wrote, "Through the windows of our spacecraft, we see the grandeur of the universe and feel, perhaps more than in any other human enterprise, the enormity of the mystery we face." Mystery, not challenge, not problem, not frontier in the engineering sense. The word carried a specific gravity for someone formed in the world that formed von Braun. The countdown sequence that became the signature ritual of the space age, the backward count from 10 to 0 that every person alive today associates with rocket launches, was itself a borrowed form, taken from the 1929 Fritz Lang science fiction film Die Frau im Mond, where it was invented purely for dramatic effect. Lang wanted audiences to feel the tension building toward an irreversible moment. The engineers of the actual rocket program adopted it wholesale, not because it served a technical function, but because it captured something true about what the moment of ignition actually felt like from the inside. An invented dramatic device became operational procedure because the emotional reality it expressed was real. 10, 9, 8. What if the rocket itself was always the ritual? Consider what a ritual actually is. Stripped of the robes and the candles and the smoke, strip away every cultural costume it has ever worn, and what you find underneath is this: A sequence of actions performed in a precise order at a precise time in a precise place, whose purpose is to transform something, to move reality from one state to another through the concentrated application of human will. The actions themselves may look arbitrary from the outside. The sequence may seem like superstition to anyone who doesn't understand its internal logic, but to the people performing it, the sequence is everything. Change the order, skip a step, rush a moment that is supposed to be held, and the whole thing collapses. The transformation doesn't happen. The threshold isn't crossed. Now read a launch checklist, not the public version, the real one. The kind that flight directors work from at 3 in the morning, when the countdown has been running for 18 hours, and there are 400 separate systems being monitored simultaneously, and a single NIST step in the sequence will scrub everything and send hundreds of people back to square one. Read the language of it, the absolute insistence on order, the way each step unlocks the next and cannot be bypassed, the way the whole procedure moves toward a single, irreversible moment, the moment of ignition, the moment of commitment, the moment when the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial is physically, violently, permanently crossed. The fuel lines purged, the oxidizer loaded, the gyroscopes aligned, the destruct systems armed, the range clear, the count resumed. This is not metaphor. The structure of a rocket launch and the structure of a ritual are not similar in the way that a map is similar to the territory it represents. They are similar in the way that two different keys are similar when they open the same lock. The question is, what is the lock? What is the door? And who exactly built it? To answer that, you have to go back further than Peenemünde, further than Parsons, further than the 20th century entirely, back to the place where the human relationship with the sky first took the form that eventually produced both the cathedral and the launch pad. Because the stars were always the altar. That is not poetry. That is the most literal description of what human beings have done with the night sky for as long as there have been human beings organized enough to do anything deliberately at all. The oldest structures we know about, the ones built before writing, before cities, before agriculture in some cases, are oriented toward the sky. Göbekli Tepe, the stone circles of Anatolia built 12,000 years ago, at a time when the people building them were still hunters with no permanent settlements, no pottery, no domesticated animals. Those structures were oriented to specific astronomical alignments. Stonehenge, Newgrange, the pyramids at Giza, aligned to within a fraction of a degree to true north, with a precision that modern engineers using modern instruments have struggled to fully replicate. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, literal artificial mountains built in flat river deltas, specifically so that the priests at the top could be as close as physically possible to the sky. Every one of these structures is the same structure in its deepest intention. It is humanity reaching upward. It is humanity refusing to accept the boundary between earth and sky as final. It is humanity insisting, with the full force of organized collective effort, that the space between the human world and whatever lives above it can be bridged, that the crossing is possible, that it has rules, that if you follow the rules precisely and completely, the crossing will be made and reality will be transformed. The priests who built Göbekli Tepe and the engineers who built the Saturn V were separated by 12,000 years of history and by every possible difference of culture, technology, language, and belief. But they were asking the same question. They were performing the same basic act. They were following the same deep logic, the logic that says, up is where the answers are, and we will build something tall enough to reach them. The Nazi occultists knew this. Not academically, they felt it, with the kind of visceral certainty that comes from years of immersion in traditions that had preserved this knowledge in fragments and symbols through centuries of official suppression. The Ahnenerbe expeditions to Tibet and Scandinavia were not random. They were targeted searches for the places where this ancient knowledge had survived most intact, the places where the original Aryan relationship to the cosmos had been least distorted by the intervening millennia of what they called spiritual decay. Himmler's obsession with the SS as a new knightly order was not nostalgia for the medieval. It was an attempt to reconstruct the conditions under which a group of initiated men could consciously participate in the same cosmic project that the builders of Stonehenge had participated in unconsciously, or rather, with a different kind of consciousness, one that the modern world had lost and that he believed could be recovered. Parsons knew it too, from the other direction, from Crowley's The Lemur, which was itself a synthesis of the Western esoteric tradition from its Hermetic and Kabbalistic roots through Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, all of it pointing toward the same conclusion, that the visible universe is not the limit of reality, that human consciousness has the capacity to engage with forces operating beyond the material surface, and that the method for doing so is not passive prayer, but active, willed, precisely structured operation, which is to say, ritual. Both traditions, from completely different starting points, had arrived at the same place, the rocket as the physical embodiment of the oldest human aspiration. The machine that doesn't just represent the crossing of the sky boundary, it actually performs it, every time, reliably, repeatedly, with a precision that the ancient priests could only have dreamed of, and that would have confirmed for them every belief they held about what was possible when the human will was organized with sufficient rigor and sufficient devotion. Here is something that the historians of the space age almost never mention, because it sits in a category that neither the scientific establishment nor the popular history industry has a comfortable way to handle. Von Braun, in the last decade of his life, became increasingly and publicly preoccupied with the question of what space travel meant. Not technically, not politically, but spiritually. He wrote about it. He gave speeches about it. He was not hedging or performing for an audience he thought wanted religiosity. He was expressing something that had been building in him for decades, something that the secular language of engineering had always been inadequate to contain. In his own words, through the windows of our spacecraft, we see the grandeur of the universe and feel, perhaps more than in any other human enterprise, the enormity of the mystery we face. That word, mystery, not problem, not challenge, not frontier in the technical sense, mystery. The word that belongs to the ancient language of initiation, the language of the threshold, the language of the experience that cannot be fully communicated to someone who hasn't undergone it. The mystery religions of ancient Greece used that word deliberately, precisely because what happened inside their rituals produced an experience that was not reducible to information, not transferable through description, not available to anyone who hadn't made the crossing themselves. Von Braun used it casually, in a speech to an audience of engineers, as if it were obvious, as if everyone in the room already knew that this was the correct word for what they were doing. Maybe they did. The moment the ritual became a launch sequence is not a moment you can pinpoint on a timeline. It wasn't a decision made in a meeting. It wasn't the result of a memo or a policy directive or a conscious choice by any single person. It happened the way that cultural transmission always happens, gradually, invisibly, through the formation of the people carrying the culture, through the assumptions built into the institutions they built, through the emotional atmosphere of the rooms where the decisions were made. But if you wanted to point to a single physical location where the two things, the ritual and the launch sequence, most completely fused into one, you would point to Cape Canaveral, specifically to Launch Complex 39, the pad built for the Saturn V rocket, the machine that carried the Apollo astronauts to the moon. The geometry of that place is not accidental. The vehicle assembly building, still one of the largest structures ever built by human beings, a structure so enormous that clouds form inside it on humid days, is oriented with a precision that the engineers justified on technical grounds, but that produces effects that go well beyond technical necessity. The crawlerway, the road along which the assembled rocket is carried from the assembly building to the launch pad, runs in a straight line at an angle that, on the morning of a launch, aligns with the rising sun. The launch pad itself sits at the edge of the land, facing east, facing the sunrise, facing the direction that the rocket will travel as it follows the Earth's rotation into orbit, east, the direction of resurrection in virtually every spiritual tradition that has ever oriented itself to the compass, the direction of the sunrise, the direction that every altar in every Christian church in the Western tradition faces, the direction that the ancient Egyptians identified with rebirth, with the overcoming of death, with the passage from one state of existence to another. The engineers who laid out Launch Complex 39 did not sit down and say, "Let's orient this toward the east, because east is the direction of resurrection." They said, "We need to launch eastward to take advantage of the Earth's rotational velocity, and we need the vehicle assembly building in a specific relationship to the pad for logistical reasons." Every decision had a technical justification. Every decision also produced an aesthetic and emotional reality that was indistinguishable from the aesthetic and emotional reality of a sacred site deliberately constructed to orient human consciousness toward the crossing of a cosmic threshold. The two explanations do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They always coexisted. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were also, simultaneously, the most technically advanced structural engineering projects of their era. The builders of Chartres and Notre Dame were solving problems of load distribution and stone tension that would have challenged engineers centuries after them. The technical achievement and the sacred purpose were not in competition. They were the same project, executed on two levels at once, and so was this. Inside Mission Control in Houston, the room where the actual decisions were made during Apollo, where the flight directors sat at their consoles and managed every second of every mission, there was a culture that the people inside it have described in terms that hover right at the edge of the sacred, without ever quite crossing into it. The flight director's authority during a mission was total and unchallengeable. The flight director's console was always manned. The room operated on a form of collective discipline that the people who worked there consistently describe with a reverence that exceeds what the technical requirements alone would have produced. Gene Kranz, the flight director for Apollo 11, and the man who famously managed the crisis of Apollo 13, wrote about mission control in terms that are more readily associated with a knightly order than with a government agency. The culture he built, the culture that landed men on the moon, was a culture of absolute commitment, absolute precision, absolute willingness to subordinate individual identity to the collective mission. Which is to say, it was the culture of an initiatory order. It was the culture that Himmler had tried to build in the SS and failed, because he had corrupted it with ideology. It was the culture that Parsons had tried to build at JPL and failed, because he had pushed it past the edge of what the institutions around him could absorb. But at Mission Control, in the strange crucible of the Apollo program, it actually worked, or came closer to working than it ever had before, or has since. The men who sat at those consoles during the Apollo missions were young, astonishingly young, average age 26 during Apollo 11. Many of them had come through the same pipeline as the German veterans, had been trained by them, had absorbed their way of thinking about the relationship between precision and audacity, between technical mastery and something that exceeded technical mastery. They worked in conditions of pressure that are genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The weight of knowing that the margin for error is zero, that the people whose lives depend on your decisions are unreachable, that if you make a mistake, you will know it immediately and irreversibly, and the knowledge will follow you for the rest of your life. That pressure does something to a group of people. It strips away everything that isn't essential. It creates a form of collective consciousness, not mystical, not supernatural, but real and documented and described by everyone who experienced it, where the group thinks faster and better together than any individual within it could think alone. The men at Mission Control during Apollo 13 described it afterward as something like a single organism, a single mind working across 24 bodies, every part of it moving in perfect coordination under conditions of maximum stress. That is also a description of a ritual working. Now here is what nobody in the official history has ever been willing to say directly, even though the evidence points to it from multiple directions simultaneously, even though the people closest to it have been circling it in their memoirs and interviews for decades without quite landing on it. The shadow behind every countdown is the shadow of everything that came before the countdown. The shadow of Wavelsberg Castle and its gas-fed eternal flame. The shadow of Jack Parsons reciting the hymn to Pan in the Mojave at 2 in the morning, with the desert cold cutting through his coat, and the equations for his next propellant formula folded in his breast pocket. The shadow of the Ahnenerbe researchers in Tibet, sitting in monasteries that had been performing the same rituals for 1,000 years, trying to understand something about the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic force that their own tradition had lost and these monks had preserved. The shadow of every human being who has ever stood on the ground and looked up and felt that the sky was not a barrier, but a door. That shadow is in every countdown, not as metaphor, as history, as the actual, traceable, documented lineage of the people who built the machines, the people who trained the operators, the people who established the culture, the people who decided what the work meant and why it was worth doing. The shadow is there because it was never removed, it was never acknowledged, so it was never addressed, so it was never resolved. It simply continued, flowing underground, shaping things from beneath the surface, visible only to people willing to look at the full picture rather than the official version. The full picture includes this: the space age was built by people who, in significant numbers, believed that the act of leaving the Earth was not merely a technical achievement, that it was a threshold crossing, with a meaning that exceeded any political or scientific framework, that the fire at the base of the rocket was continuous with every fire that human beings had ever lit in the service of reaching towards something beyond themselves. The campfire, the altar flame, the burning torch carried to the top of the ziggurat, the gas-fed eternal flame in the basement of Wewelsburg Castle. The fulminative mercury explosion that killed Jack Parsons in his Pasadena laboratory on a June morning in 1952, and the fire at the base of the Saturn V on July 16, 1969 at 9:32 in the morning Eastern Time, when the 5 F1 engines ignited simultaneously and produced a sound that people felt in their chests from miles away. A sound like the earth splitting. A sound like a door being forced open by something too large and too powerful to be stopped. And the rocket rose. The ritual completed. The threshold crossed. 3 men in a capsule at the top of that fire, climbing away from everything that had ever defined the limits of human existence, heading toward a place where the sky finally ran out. And below them, in mission control, in the blockhouse at the Cape, in the offices of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where the German veterans had built their American careers, in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, where Jack Parsons had worked before the institutions decided his beliefs were too inconvenient to tolerate, in all of those places, people who had dedicated their lives to this moment stood or sat in absolute silence, watching the numbers climb, feeling something that none of the technical language they had spent their careers perfecting had ever given them a way to say. The rocket rose, and it kept rising, and it did not stop. And now the question that has been running underneath everything. The question that started with a man in an SS uniform dreaming of spacecraft, and a man in a Pasadena mansion invoking ancient gods before lighting his engines. That question is about to split open in a direction that nobody in the official history anticipated. Because the framework that these men carried into the space age didn't stop when the Apollo program ended. It didn't retire when the last Saturn V flew. It went somewhere. It was inherited by someone. And the inheritors built something that makes the Saturn V look like a rehearsal.